Some linguists have been faithful to the call of duty to meet empiricist demands when facing the richness and complexity of language, while some have yielded to the temptation of a cosmologist, striving towards sweeping abstractions and generalizations. The so-called chicken or egg question, or questions, have been baffling philosophers, physicists, psychologists and linguists since Plato and Democritus, throughout the Middle Ages until modern times. Ontological questions bearing such dichotomies as idealism, materialism, universalism, nominalism, as well as epistemological echoes yielding equally important oppositions, since Descartes, Leibniz, Kant, Locke, and Hume, rationalism, empiricism, a priori, a posteriori, deduction, induction, synthesis, analysis, subjective, objective, probabilistic, deterministic, and the like, have been both inspiring and equally haunting in discussions on human mind and language. Linguists, unlike physicists, whose main notational tool is mathematics, cannot rely on a single common notational convention. Therefore, the history of linguistics, especially the history of linguistics of the 20th and 21st centuries, has provided an arena for the search of the most elusive and equally complex entity in the known universe, the product of human mind and human society, language, in the vein that appears to be more adventurous than geographical explorations of Marco Polo or even the exploration of the outer space. In this quest, linguists and philosophers employed various metaphors to grasp the nature of the phenomenon called language, which range from viewing language as part of our conceptual system in the subjective mind to pragmatic conceptions that stress the intersubjective aspect of it. Structuralism, functionalism, generativism, and cognitivism strove to employ machineries of their own to describe and explain the phenomena in question. Metaphors of structure system and function tool came to the fore and were followed by a multitude of novel conceptions, like language as a generative process, mathematical, language as a transactional situation, social, economic, language as a problem-solving activity, psychological, language as an organic adaptive system, ecological, language involving valency properties, chemical, language as a network system, stratificational, systemic, just to name a few. Various levels of reductionism and various formalizations have accompanied this seemingly endless enterprise. My view on language is equally baffling, let alone my position allows multiplicity of perspectives, as it seems to me that every approach and every set of theoretical assumptions, no matter how peculiar and distant from its apparent opponents it may be, is bound to shed some new light on at least a slice of reality. Joan Bybee, in her recent book, Language, Usage and Cognition, defined language with poetic refinement, involving the sand dunes imagery. Quote, "Sand dunes have apparent regularities of shape and structure, yet they also exhibit considerable variation among individual instances, as well as gradients and change over time. Languages differ from one another while still being patently shaped by the same principles." Unquote. My view is similar in that the tremendous richness of human perceptual, emotional, aesthetic, intellectual and social experience needs a system that grasps it richly enough to secure our biological and spiritual selves. Language variability across diachronic, regional, social, and stylistic dimensions provides evidence for it. But linguistic systems also need to handle their resources in an economical way. Hence they employ all possible strategies, like other adaptive systems, in order to fit the economy principle. Thus they employ polysemy as a means to ensure emergence of new senses within the confines of the same form, as well as they strive to maximize their expressive power through mutual interpenetration of subsystems, morphological, lexical, syntactic. This paper is bound to follow the temptation of a cosmologist, someone who acknowledges the fact that the universe is complex and diverse, but also someone who allows a bit of adventurous speculation that stems from the fact that the universe is skewed and it is not the way it looks on the surface. The apparent reductionism that may seemingly emerge from simplified and overtly idealized representations, not just only for heuristic reasons, needs to be treated in organic terms and not as a building block metaphor. As Mohan and Mohan suggest, all languages display grammar, namely morphosyntactic exponents to mark number, case, tense, aspect, modality, space, time, causation, and purpose. But grammar, as such, does not mark such conceptions as mind, society, truth, beauty, and morality. Stating the problem. In this paper, we shall argue, I'm still working towards it, in this paper we shall argue that there should exist a shared mental representation shaped by what is universal to human condition. If the assumption that human language is deeply rooted in embodied experience is valid, then all humans do share such conceptions as space, time, motion, that is process change, causation, that's cause and effect, agency, that's intent and purpose. Actors on stage, in other words, semantic participants in the circumstantial realm, and interactions among these participants will display commonalities despite the tremendous variability of specific natural and cultural environments in which and through which languages have evolved, also producing variability of their own. In terms of segmentation of constructed reality through linguistic exponents and ranges of entailments that emerge from them. It is assumed that time and space are mutually adjacent, as well as matter and energy create a continuum. This claim does not only stem from relativistic physics, but can be supported by a range of metaphors and dual constructions in natural languages, which preserve topological neutralities and strive for gradual disembodiment along the embodied imaginative spectrum. In a likewise fashion, quantum phenomena such as the particle-wave duality, the particle-field duality, and the wave-field duality are not only to be witnessed in subatomic reality, but dwell happily within linguistic constructs. Finally, we shall adhere to the assumption that linguistic units display topological plasticity. And that's, now I think on the handout you've got an overview of cognitive linguistics. Okay. Oh, here. It looks very much like this. But I like this representation, but I don't think I have time to stop and discuss it. It's sort of, kind of an attempt to bring together mass, energy, time, and space. Now let's, I'm just going to go over the, I'm sure most of us are familiar with the basics of cognitive linguistics, and definitely the handout shows the basic assumptions, but I'd like to address some of them. excuse me. So the guiding assumption of cognitive linguistics rests on the claim that language, like general perception, relies on the fundamental figure and ground alignment, and an act of perception is an act of construction. And here's my favorite representation, just to change the tune and change media. The act of perception is an act of construction. Well, I assume we have constructed some conception in our minds thanks to this. This act of construction is manifested through standard to target act of comparison and scanning operations, summary and sequential scanning, in both general perception and linguistic processing. Therefore, mind is considered to be a process, and meaning is equal to conceptualization. The notion of meaning is to be taken both as embodied and imaginative. As embodied, it is online, peripherally connected, actual, mediated by sensory perception, and imaginative, it's offline, autonomous, virtual, potential, in the mind. In other words, our minds are bodily connected, and processing takes place in an alternating fashion, online and offline. The alternation mode is both parallel and densely distributed in the organic sense. Creativity, dreaming, and fantasy rest grossly on the offline mode first, but it requires the feed-forward versus feedback alternation in the case of artistic activities such as painting, improvising a musical piece or writing, as well as other more prosaic cognitive activities like playing tennis or driving a car or drawing a koala bear representation at least. Lexical concepts or cognitive models are considered to be open-ended and encyclopedic. Words, in their acoustic and graphic forms, activate configurations of knowledge stored in long-term semantic memory for concepts, interfacing and occasionally activating long-term storage in episodic memory for scenes and situations. A concept is to be understood as a matrix of domains, and which is experientially formed by bodily sensory data and abstracted elements. Lexical concepts cluster in various relations with other words forming grammatical constructions. Grammatical constructions in themselves, that is, alone beyond specific meanings of lexical words, carry conceptual import. Grammatical constructions are thus imagistic, like figures in a carpet, and to a degree also iconic. In other words, grammar is image. We know a word by the company it keeps, and every word can be n times polysemous. Consider red in red wine and red hair, or the verb to sink. The boat sank in transitive, the storm sank the boat, transitive, the sun sank over the Moonbee Range, metaphorical with an adverbial, she sank her teeth in a juicy pear. What kind of sinking is that? Or my heart sank, metaphorical again. The interpenetration between lexical concepts and grammatical constructions rests at the core of novelty of expression. Linguistic units are also topological in nature. They preserve neutralities of shape, size, closure. Topology is kind of non-Euclidean approach to space, approach to geometry. I'm looking for my toy. I've got it in my pocket. It's yellow as far as I remember. Well, it's very difficult to fish it out whenever you need it. Oh, here it is. I wish I had a little camera, visualizer camera to show it. It's a balloon with a triangle on it. It's an equilateral triangle. So the triangle still stays the triangle if I inflate the balloon. I could do it a little bit bright. So it's still the balloon. Yes, it is a balloon, but it's still a triangle, and it's still a triangle. And it stays a triangle if I put it on a flat surface, right? So topology is this kind of rubber sheet geometry, right? So linguistic units are also topological in nature, in the sense that they are plastic. The plasticity is somehow accommodated by immediate collocation and the grammatical construction in which they are embedded, and probably textual background and pragmatic considerations of usage. So we could say that every word is used. Oh, nothing. Oh, that's my mouse. Playing tricks on me. So we could say that every word is used only once in the entire history of the universe. In the entire history of the universe. Because it's always used uniquely, in unique collocations. And even if collocations are not unique, then probably grammatical constructions or textual background or usage instance. So if we say linguistic units are topological in nature and they preserve neutralities, we mean shape, size, enclosure, and many more. The credit goes to Len Talmy. Size, for instance, this chair and that chair, this planet and that planet. We do not need separate words for this and that, depending on actual distance. Rubber sheet geometry. Or shape, closure. Shape neutrality. Imagine it's a road. I ran across the road. I zigzagged across the road. And I circled across the road. Acrossness is preserved despite different shapes. That's shape neutrality. It would work with many other units, especially prepositions. Other issues crucial to cognitive linguistic description and explanation of meaning construction are also instrumental in cognitive stylistic analysis, that is categorizing relationships, metaphorical cross-domain mappings based on analogy, and metonymic intra-domain mappings based on continuity, finally mental spaces and their conceptual integration into novel structures selectively projected in so-called blended spaces. And now I'll move on to some, whenever I mean talk about ontological quanta, I take into consideration all types of ontologies or beings, modes of existence. A uniplex, a multiplex, I'm giving myself some respite now. A substance, uncountable, and containment, a container. A container is countable, it's got boundaries. And of course, the trick is that if you look at the uniplex, for instance, a potato. A potato is a countable noun. You can make it into a container and substance. How much starch does this potato contain? Or a stone. How much substance lime, does this stone contain? Of course, you have various dualities here. You can move it into multiplex, a collection. You can make multiplex into multiplex multiplexes, 3 collections of coins. And now multiplex can also be changed into a container when you impose virtual boundary on it. For instance, how many coins does your collection contain? And of course, substance can also be turned into a container. When you say, for instance, I jumped into the water, I am in the water. But the boundary of the container is different. And this is what I basically call dualities, right? So in quantum physics you have particle, multiple particles, field and wave, right? And then all the combinations can be tested, and they're also found in language. I think these can be quite basic, rudimentary forms of, let's not worry about that. Oh dear, thank you. Thank you much. They are just rudimentary to basic metaphorization. I call it virtual boundary. And of course you also have virtual motion, which is also a kind of metaphor. The road ran to the forest. The road is a static entity which is given the motion-like quality, right? So it's a little bit like a metaphor. A static object is a moving object. So whenever I talk about this slightly intimidating concept of dualities, I'm not a physicist, I'm not a mathematician. I am just inspired by some of these ideas, and that's it. So relativistic values of time-space which are mutually adjacent, and matter-energy systems which are mutually convertible, and quantum phenomena, particle, wave, field, dualities, inspire the understanding of the phenomenological mode of processing, such as the individuation of objects, locations and events. And as we have said, linguistic units are taken to be topological in nature, as Talmy put it. At the fine structural level, the conceptualization language shows greater affinity to topology. Now, on your handout, number 2, image schemata. It's tricky. Okay. It jumped. This is what I feared. Yes, Mr. Tidy has done his job now. Yes, the notion of image schemata is probably best known among the candidates for topological structures. Image schemata can be defined as preconceptual, non-propositional, kinesthetic analogues which arise from bodily orientations and interactions. They are genetically pre-programmed and actualized through experience. They can be classified according to such criteria as space object, time energy, dominance, and spatial orientational dimensions can be added to them. In fact, all the skeletal idealizations are heavily interconnected in the experiential dimension and also involve various degrees of mutual conflation of space-time energy dimensions, which results in the rise of such duals as object-location dual, object-event dual, force-path dual, etc. In metaphorical projections, overall topological structure is said to be preserved, which is known as the invariance principle. And of course, image schematic transformations are also possible, number 3 on your handout. Those multiplex to mass, for instance, the crowd poured into the building, right? There's a multiplex to mass transformation. That's probably the crowd poured into the building situation, and many more, also virtual motion. So it is hypothesized that some of the image schematic operations also involve the blending process. Now, metaphor coherences Coherence is a metaphor. Conceptual metaphors are highly skeletal across domains, across domain source-to-target mappings of ontological and epistemic relations. When conventionalized, different mappings regarding the same conception display a high degree of mutual coherence, much of which rests upon what I would like to call topological compatibility. If linguistic expressions concerning a concept but emergent from different mutually coherent conceptual mappings are mixed up in one utterance, there is no ill effect on the overall logic of the utterance. So here we've got the classical example from Lakoff and Johnson. I'm going to do it on the board online. Online processing is much better than click processing. So far we have been here, but we haven't been here yet. We have got this much, but we haven't got this much yet. So if you mix up the metaphor, so far we have constructed the core of our argument. You've got a particle construction here as well. You mix up three types of metaphors: horizontal, one-dimensional; vertical, one-dimensional, or 2.5-dimensional, whichever you prefer to think about constructing. Just to simplify it, just one line. And three-dimensional. There's no ill effect to the overall logic. This is coherence across metaphors. You could even push it further. So far we have constructed the core of our arguments. Now we can expand on it, and we can dig deep into it. So here is the, this is my little obsession, to think that certain linguistic units, even though they are embodied, they strive for gradual disembodiment. So probably the next step will be disembodied semantics, no matter how. Or spiritual semantics. Okay, so my time is, oh dear me, now I'll have to abandon the microphones in that case, or just use it. Probably I'll use the handout, and we'll just, give up the machine. I'll use the board, and I will go back to the machine towards the end of the presentation, because I've got lovely examples to share, to show conceptual bridges, because this is what I'm supposed to talk about. Now, metonymy is profile shifting. Of course, metonymy and metaphor can work on the level of polysemy. Oh, I feel much more relieved. I'm sorry. Oh, thank you very much. Well, I might. No, thank you very much, Peter. I think I will go back to my natural mode of existence. This is the way I do things whenever I teach students. Excuse me. I don't want to play a teacher, but metaphorical polysemy: head as a body part and head of the nail, leg as a body part and leg of the desk. And metonymic polysemy: church as a building on the Church of England, profile shifting. Of course, the most classical versions of metaphor and metonymy are synonymous. They celebrate the example of love is a journey and time is money, and Plato is on the top shelf and I need hands for work. So profile shifting, analogy and profile shifting. They also work on larger parts of discourse. Metaphor can probably work intertextually between Ulysses and Odyssey, and, well, what a stand in terms of historical time. Ulysses by Joyce and Odyssey by Homer. And in metonymy, definitely you've got profile shifting in scripts and scenarios. How did you arrive here? I hailed a taxi. You extract just part of the script. Metonymically, to stand for the entire and activate the entire structure of knowledge. Or how did you arrive here? I had my 20s lucky for the for the taxi. How did you arrive here? I was clever enough to how to get my good friends to get me here by taxi. Thank you much. And he asked to hang a bit closer. Okay, so definitely, how did our visitors arrive in Poland? They flew by air or by plane. So you've got three elements within the frame: the plane, the process of flying, and the medium of air, and you activate one of them into the figure-like prominence, and the rest has been decoded, right? The next one is alternate construals. Alternate construals involve alternate ways of construing a situation. For instance, the clouds below the plane and the plane above the clouds. Number 6 in your handout. Dual structures. The conception of duals rests upon a similar cognitive principle of asymmetrical alternation, but duals can be defined much more in terms of alternate virtual constructions, which, despite different, often conflicting parameters, even bordering on the paradoxical, preserve logical coherence. Consider the example, it's an easy one. Time is a moving object and time is a static object, you will. For instance, the year 2015 is approaching, and we are approaching the year 2015. Conceptualizers approaching time which is static, or time approaching conceptualizers who are static. The common denominator, probably very much like the generic space in a blend, is just the diminishing of distance conception. But the next example is much more challenging. It's the it cannot be reduced to a simple common denominator, and its interfacing counterparts turn out to be mutually exclusive, and they are still semantically compatible. For instance, when you say, cast your mind to your childhood, in the sense of explore your memory, and go in your mind to your childhood, in the same or similar sense, explore your memory. I use a different color for contrast only. Cast your mind to your childhood. Self and mind are separated, and time is understood in terms of externalized realm. Whereas when you say go in your mind to your childhood, self and mind are still together, not separated, and time is internalized. If we treat these two phrases, or these two utterances, to be synonymous, we can see the whole paradox arising from dualities. So I consider it one of the black holes, right? Like cosmologists would say, oh, look, here we've got a black hole. I sometimes look at linguistic units in a similar way. This is just, one of those interesting points. You also have the lexical dual, share, number 8 on your handout. We can share a bar of chocolate, can't wait for the break. No, and then the bar of chocolate is maybe somewhere there. And we share this room. Now, we don't need a separate verb for sharing something which is external to the participants, or something where participants are immersed. There's some modular coherences under 9. I'm going to skip it, and I'm going to skip number 10. And then mental spaces and blends, I think there's no need to explain these. Mental spaces utilize our, sort of flexible, topologically flexible elements which are set up locally for ongoing discourse and thought. They are you need a mental space builder in order to set it up. Right. And the celebrated example from Foucault in 1985. In reality, Lisa's eyes are blue, but in the picture, in Foucault they are red, they're green, but I haven't got a green pen, so I'll make it into, they are red. So the roles and values and identity principle and connectors, and of course they are the step, along with the invariance principle and categorization by schema, they are a step to create blends and blended mental spaces. Here is the generic space, most skeletal, very often referred to in terms of vital relations, and the novel structure would be a blend. Now forget Lisa for this very instance. So definitely blends are used to explain many things. Symbolic behavior. So if I stood like this, definitely, excuse me, eminent professors, and I said now I'm a jumbo jet pilot. Well, this could be quite risky. Right. I immediately change this room into a jumbo jet and change your roles into the roles of passengers. Right, so that's symbolic behavior rituals, and many other phenomena can be explained by means of blended mental spaces. I have to cut the long story short, which is never short. 27, 28, and 29, please scan over them. Now the mega black hole. That's, Peter, how much? Oh dear me. I'm sorry. Before I came here I said, well, how am I going to survive such a long time? And I'm quite sorry to know it's only 5 minutes. Oh dear me. Probably each of these representations, now you have all those quanta. Now when it comes to the quanta, the little bits of uniplexes, multiplexes, time and space, I have a shortcut for it. How to integrate object in space, distributed in some sense, and action, and frequency. Excuse me, professors. Here you've got some entities which are, they're just holes, they're discontinuities. Let's consider them to be objects. And when I'm doing this, I fold space, time, frequency, distribution of objects in space, etc. And this is when you go into my little representation, which that's what I'm driving at. It's now these things need to be probably discussed in. This one is the conflation. I would like to talk about it in terms of an onion layer or a layer cake. And it, you know, adverbials of space, time, motion, causation. Well, causation, reason, purpose. When I mean reason, I mean intent. Cause is also reason. It depends whether we're talking about physical causation or agentive causation. Agentive causation would require purpose. And condition and concession. Concession is a little bit like a conditional with its sleeves rolled up or turned inside out. They produce entailments which probably allow translation and also paraphrase, intralinguistic paraphrase, cross-linguistic translation. I'm going to explain it to you in a minute. The next one is the matrix. This is a little bit like space-time which have been split. Of course, they are adjacent in real world, and Leibniz said that what really exists is events, and time and space are artifacts. No wonder Leibniz somehow preconceived of the relativity theory a few centuries before Einstein. And here you have the whole lot. You might as well, in this representation, you might squeeze in my amounts from the previous representations of ontological quanta. You also have space for frequency They can be done in a scale, they can be done in a two-dimensional representation, in three-dimensional representation. And of course, what you need to allow here, this grid is quite rigid, Euclidean. But if you allow topological flexibility, and if you allow the polysemous nature of units, especially prepositions, which here are treated in their central senses, then probably it would approximate the universe at large and our experiential universe. And now let's go back to the layered representation. I mean, this one can be translated, this is the split representation, this one can be translated into what I call the conceptual bridge matrix. And here you've got the affected part of the spectrum. You have space for circumstantial, that is adverbials of space, time, causation, etc. So the layered cake, I'm sorry, I have to go back to that one. And do it quickly. I'll do it as quickly as possible. That's time, that's space, locations in space, locations in time. And then you go into stative verbs, dynamic verbs, stative verbs. You could also have locations for qualities. If you say, for instance, the milk went sour, quality is like space. Sweet, sour, location, right? So you even have space for adjectival elements. Definitely you've got space for distributors to and from and along, since and to and until and during, and all the frequencies. And now I promise to cut the long story short, which never turns out to be short. Now you have got space, time, causation, the force vector, cause and effect. If you've got agentive causation, you've got intent and purpose, the endpoint schema. And then condition, if, then, concession, despite something did not occur, is also to be compressed there. Of course, you can translate it into the layered or onion-like shaped representation, but that's can be squeezed into this one. Space for circumstantial semantic roles, and of course you also have space for case. And of course, in English, case is understood in well encoded in terms of word order plus prepositional phrases. In other languages, case is much more flexible and it's encoded inflectionally. But here you've got the three layers of semantic roles. Agent, instrument, patient, agent, mover, recipient, agent, stimulus, experiencer. Of course, you might have no agent behind some forces of nature, then you have a source of force, right? And what you do, of course, that state, change, state. Now, this is for energy transfer. This is for location transfer. And this would be for stimulus transfer. And of course, verbs are mentioned on some of my handout. I think I should probably have elaborated more on it. Well, I broke the window with a hammer. I broke the window with a hammer. Now, windowing of attention. The hammer broke the window and the window broke. The same can be done with cutting. In other words, sometimes you have an identical verb depending on its argument structure and valency properties. Then now you've got I sent Mary a letter, I sent a letter to Mary, two different construals. Of course, if you have no agent you might have the wind is blowing, just a mover. And of course I showed Mary a photograph. This is the most dense and complex type of causation because it's mental causation. And she looked at it, experiencer agent, and from what she saw, it was a photograph of her own when she was 3 years old. And the space for case, from, to, and with works. It all gels. You can also have conflations of these roles. If I kissed Mary, instrument is enfolded in the verb. Or if I punched John. If I ran, not quite risky for me, then I'm agent mover. If I made a funny face, I'm agent stimulus. So conflation is also possible. So windowing of attention, conflation. And number 3 is, what is it? Conflations. Shifting of perspective, I sold him my car, he bought the car from me, etc. Of course, you know, some of these are also inherent in verbs. And you also have metaphorical projections among these, which, like for instance, I gave her a rose and I gave her a big love. Right? So, or I gave my students such a fright, telling them they're going to have a test, which is not very likely. But, okay, so anyway, this machinery seems to be stable. I also work towards the beneficiary role. The time is up. I'm terribly sorry. So I'm going to just to flick, at least with no words. I'm going to show the examples. What I can do is just Polish niedoszły widz and would-be spectator. 2 different layers. The onion layer works, yes. Let's skip this one. In English, once in a blue moon and raz od wielkiego dzwonu. The same conceptual base serves translation. That's the conceptual bridge. I owe you $50 and masz u mnie $5, $50. Here is a risky one. I'm dying for a drink and umieram z pragnienia, right? English people are much more purpose-oriented and positive, or English speakers, right? Whereas Polish people will moan, umieram z pragnienia. They will upgrade the cause of their state of. Anyway, if the worst comes to the worst, is yet another one. The common conceptual base, w najgorszym razie, and you also have, you know, different from, different to, and different than. British, Australian, American. I could give a topological representation to justify for these differences. Probably also, well, proverbs, and I'm sorry, Piotr, I'm a naughty boy.
I know.
And I think in language contact situations, when, for instance, in Salmon Islands, you've got Picanini #1, belong Mrs. Queen. That's Prince Charles, right? Picanini #1, the child #1, belong Mrs. Queen. Belong is just being along the path to, and the off schema works with belong. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Professor. I think we have time for 2 quick questions. Professor Kleparski.
Thank you, Professor Skrzypczak. I'd like to congratulate you on your presentation. I just can't wait to see it printed in one of Professor Godlewski's volumes. So probably the next one. But I have a comment and a question at the same time. You see, let me dwell upon this prosaic cognitive experience. Prosaic cognitive experience, right? Don't you think that prosaic, as you call it, cognitive experience very often promotes and provokes, first of all, and promotes, provokes and promotes in that order, very non-prosaic, barrier-breaking, metaphorically cross-domain transfers, diachronically speaking and synchronically speaking. I would even try to develop a rule that the more prosaic it is, the greater potential for metaphorization is.
I would say so. For as much as I could follow your question and line of reasoning in that question, when I said prosaic, I just wanted to contrast playing tennis and driving a car as much more externally.
Let me give you a better example. You see, there's nothing more prosaic for a woman than carrying a bag. Than carrying a bag for a woman.
Right, yes.
Whether it's
well, it's a matter
bag
of attitudes, a matter of cultures and systems of values.
Well, let's stick to European
Right.
culture, okay? So
Yes.
carrying a bag of whatever nature, evening dress bag or handbag or a carry bag. You see, one of my students has recently made quite long research on the history of English bag. Very simple cognitive experience, carrying a bag. And it turns out that in the history of English, there have been not thousands, but hundreds of extremely interesting cross-barrier metaphorical transfer, unthinkable.
Well, I
metaphorical
assume
transfers. See?
lots of semantic change relies on metaphorical shifts.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's the only comment I wanted to make. Thank you very much.
Thank
So
you. And
definitely every cognitive activity is sort of, peripherally connected through autonomous process and peripherally connected through the online process and autonomous through the offline process. And there's definitely some kind of yin-yang between each of them. If playing tennis, for instance, or carrying a bag is much more physical and kinesthetic and requires control over the space and gravitational pull, that's definitely in the way I called it prosaic. Whereas when you fantasize or daydream or create a poem inside your mind, or even solve a mathematical problem autonomously,
that's exactly
it's a
what I
little
meant,
less prosaic. And I assume semantic change relies on both of them, because they cannot be fully separated. It's only a matter of degree and proportion. It's very much like my very first representation with this kind of yin-yang concentration of concentrated elements within and outside. So I don't know whether I have answered your question, but
Certainly have.
yes.
thank you. And the final question, Professor Godlewski.
I would like to thank Professor Skrzypczak for your extremely inspiring lecture.
Thank you very much, Stoi.
I wish it were longer. And I would like to ask about one of the points you made in the first part of your lecture about the plasticity of language.
Right.
And about the thesis that perhaps each word was used only once in the history of the universe. In physics it's said sometimes that the universe is infinite but limited. Do you find any recognizable, graspable but general limitations of plasticity of language? And if I could, only one small maybe remark rather than a question. Do you take into consideration the cultural differentiation of cognitive structures and categories? Because in some cultures the categories like time, space, treated separately, and causality either are shaped differently or do not exist at all in such a form. Thank you.
All right. When it comes to the limitations of human language, definitely, I just recently delivered a paper on an Australian poet, and I did a cognitive stylistic analysis of metaphorical projections in that poem. And in conclusions I said, it's yet another example that language is an open system. Its creativity potential is boundless. But since we human beings have evolved on this planet, let's say from the last common ancestor, that's Luca, last universal common ancestor, which is probably the first unicellular organism. If you assume the evolutionary scenario, idea of the debate between creationists and evolutionists is that the only difference between both positions is time. So whenever I talk to my students about the world or universe, I say Mother Nature or God, whichever you prefer to take. But I think since our organisms and cultures have been shaped by the external environments as adaptive systems as such, the limitations are constrained by our biological selves, probably our spiritual selves in terms of the discursive formations that we carry within us as archetypes or also cultural constructs. So definitely there are certain limitations to language which are defined by the limitations of our bodies and societies and environments. But again, Mother Nature or God, whichever you prefer, designed us in such a way, or we evolved in such a way, whichever you prefer, that we can flexibly meet new universes, conceptual universes and environments, and we create and recreate them. So that's the beauty of it. So I don't know where the limits are, really, very much like we don't know what's going on at the subatomic level very, very, very deep inside an atom. When it comes to categories, yes, definitely. I would say there is yet another principle in quantum physics. Except for duality, you've got dislocation and mutual entanglement. And I'll use this metaphor. I'm sure that whenever we encode a certain portion of information about conceptual and constructed reality in an utterance or series of utterances, we will probably trigger off a certain implicit range of hierarchies, that's implicational hierarchies like entailments. So even if time or space are not clearly encoded in some sentences, they can be inferred from some other bits through dislocation. So that's my provisional answer to your wonderful question. Thank you much.
Thank you.